The B-29 pilot who witnessed the moment that changed everything in Vietnam. The B-29's instrument panel flickered through humid Vietnamese air, while sweat dripped from my oxygen mask onto controls that trembled with each thermal updraft from the jungle fire 25,000 feet below. Through the bombardier's window, I could see them. An American reconnaissance platoon that had been advancing with textbook precision just minutes earlier, now scattered across a clearing like toys abandoned by a child who had lost interest in playing war. Radio static filled my headset with voices I barely recognized as belonging to the same men who had reported in with professional calm at the start of the mission. Their transmissions now fragmented into bursts of panic that carried across the airwaves like prayers offered to a god who had stopped listening. The smell of cordite and burning vegetation somehow penetrated our pressurized cabin, mixing with the metallic taste of fear that seemed to coat the inside of my mouth as I watched individual soldiers below making decisions that would haunt them for decades, if they survived the next hour. Heat thermals rising from the triple canopy jungle created turbulence that sent our superfortress lurching through air thick with smoke and something else, something psychological that seemed to seep through aluminum and steel to reach the crew compartment, where 4 men sat in silence, knowing they were witnessing something that would never appear in any mission report, because admitting it happened would mean acknowledging that everything we believed about American military superiority was more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. Through my binoculars, I watched the precise moment when modern warfare revealed its true nature, not the clean technological conflict that Pentagon briefings described, but something ancient and terrible that turned young men into hollowed-out survivors, carrying memories too heavy for human minds to process completely. What they didn't realize was that this moment would stay with me longer than any bombing run, any fighter engagement, any of the official actions that fill squadron histories and medal citations. If you're here for the truth they never wanted recorded, stay until the end and subscribe so these stories don't die with us. To understand how I ended up seeing something no pilot should ever witness, we need to go back to a farm in Iowa, where a 14-year-old boy first heard the sound of aircraft engines cutting through autumn air and looked up to see a formation of B-25 Mitchells banking over cornfields that rolled toward the horizon in waves of gold and green. That boy was me, and from that moment forward, everything else in my life became preparation for the day I would command one of those machines that could carry American power to any point on Earth where enemies threatened the values we had been raised to defend without question. My father raised corn and soybeans with the methodical persistence of a man who understood that some challenges required patience rather than force, working soil that had been in our family for 3 generations, while teaching me lessons about persistence and responsibility that would prove more relevant to military aviation than anything I learned during the recruitment rallies that swept through rural communities as America prepared for conflicts in places most of us couldn't locate on a map. He would stand in those same fields where I had first seen military aircraft, pointing out how different crops required different approaches, how understanding your tools was more important than forcing them beyond their capabilities. The local airfield was nothing more than a grass strip where crop dusters would land occasionally for fuel, but to my young eyes, it represented connection to a larger world where technology and human courage could overcome any obstacle if applied with sufficient dedication. I spent entire summer afternoons watching those agricultural pilots work, learning that flying wasn't just about controlling an aircraft, but about reading conditions that existed beyond human senses. Wind currents invisible to the naked eye, weather patterns that could be felt rather than seen, mechanical rhythms that meant the difference between successful operations and catastrophic failure. When the Army Air Forces began recruiting aircrew for the B-29 Superfortress program, I enlisted before I had fully processed what military service might require, motivated by patriotic duty, but driven even more by dreams of mastering machines that represented the pinnacle of American industrial achievement. The recruiting sergeant, a tired man named Patterson who wore his ribbons like they weighed more than they should, looked at my test scores and background before announcing that I qualified for pilot training on the newest and most advanced bomber in the world. Basic flight training took place at fields across the American South, where the climate provided year-round flying weather and vast expanses of empty territory offered margin for error that new pilots required, while learning to control machines that could kill them and their instructors with equal efficiency. The aircraft we trained in, PT-19s and BT-13s and 86s, seemed primitive compared to the B-29s we would eventually fly, but they taught fundamental principles about the relationship between pilot and machine that remained constant regardless of size or complexity. Advanced training brought me to my first B-29, and the moment I saw her sitting on the ramp at Walker Army Airfield in Kansas, I understood that everything before had been preparation for this encounter. She was enormous compared to anything I had previously seen. Wingspan longer than the distance between buildings in most small towns, fuselage capacity that could accommodate crews larger than many business establishments, engines that represented more horsepower than entire farm operations. Flight training revealed both the mechanical complexity and psychological demands of strategic aviation. Learning to fly the B-29 required understanding systems so sophisticated that mastering them completely demanded months of study that went far beyond basic piloting skills. The aircraft was a technological marvel, pressurized cabin that allowed operations at altitudes where enemy interceptors became ineffective. Navigation equipment that could find targets anywhere in the world, with precision that exceeded most ground-based surveys. Defensive armament controlled by computer-assisted fire control systems that could engage threats from any direction with accuracy that individual gunners couldn't match. But more challenging was developing the mental discipline necessary to function effectively during missions that could last 12 hours or more. Flying through weather conditions that grounded smaller aircraft while carrying ordnance loads sufficient to alter the strategic balance in entire regions of the world. The psychological isolation of strategic bombing operations, flying at altitudes where the Earth became an abstract pattern of colors and shapes, created unique pressures that affected aircrew in ways that couldn't be anticipated through training exercises conducted over friendly territory. The B-29 became more than just an aircraft. She was a flying cathedral of American engineering that represented our industrial capacity, transformed into weapons platform capable of projecting power across any distance. Everything about her suggested strength held in careful balance. The four Wright R-3350 engines that could carry enormous loads to altitudes where human survival required artificial support, the remote-controlled turrets that provided defensive coverage through overlapping fields of fire, the bomb bay capacity that could accommodate destruction sufficient to level city blocks while maintaining aerodynamic efficiency necessary for intercontinental operations. Flying her required not just technical competence, but emotional preparation for participating in warfare conducted at scales that challenged individual comprehension. Strategic bombing missions involved decisions that affected thousands of people who would never be seen by the aircrew responsible for their fate, creating psychological distances that allowed normal human beings to participate in destruction that would have been impossible to inflict through direct personal violence. The crew that formed around our aircraft came together through the random process that characterized all military assignments. 10 men from different backgrounds, united by specialized training that made them interchangeable parts in a larger machine dedicated to delivering ordnance to targets selected by strategists who would never experience the psychological consequences of their planning. Decisions. Our navigator, Lieutenant Chen, could calculate positions anywhere in the world using instruments that seemed to border on magic, while our bombardier, Flight Officer Martinez, possessed mathematical precision required to place explosives on targets from altitudes where human features became invisible. But it was our radio operator, Sergeant O'Malley, who provided the clearest perspective on how strategic warfare differed from the individual combat that had characterized previous conflicts. He monitored frequencies that carried communications between ground forces engaged in fighting that still resembled traditional military operations, infantry and armor maneuvering for tactical advantage, artillery providing fire support for advances measured in yards rather than miles, commanders making decisions based on intelligence gathered by personnel who moved on foot through terrain where visibility was limited to whatever lay beyond the next ridge or forest. From altitude, such warfare looked like elaborate games played with miniature figures, formations moving in patterns that revealed the thinking of commanders who still believed that victory went to whoever could concentrate the most firepower at decisive points on two-dimensional battlefields. But strategic bombing represented evolution beyond such limitations, extending warfare into three-dimensional space, where small numbers of aircrew could influence ground operations across areas that exceeded the scope of entire previous wars. The mission briefing that changed everything began in a windowless room at Anderson Air Force Base that smelled of coffee and mildew, with intelligence officers who spoke in careful euphemisms about reconnaissance support and battlefield observation, without explaining why a strategic bomber was being used for missions that seemed better suited to smaller, more maneuverable aircraft. The target coordinates placed us over jungle terrain in Tai Ninh province, near the Cambodian border, where enemy infiltration routes carried supplies and personnel through landscape that defied conventional military logic. The briefing officer, a nervous captain named Hendricks, who kept adjusting his glasses and referring to notes he immediately returned to a classified folder, used language that created more questions than it answered. He spoke about specialized observation requirements and tactical reconnaissance coordination, while carefully avoiding specific details about what we were supposed to observe or why standard reconnaissance aircraft couldn't accomplish the same objectives. The weather briefing emphasized ground visibility conditions rather than flight operations, suggesting that our primary function was watching rather than doing. But there were details that created unease among aircrew who had learned to read between the lines of official briefings. Radio frequencies were different from our usual channels, using authentication codes that changed every few minutes according to schedules none of us had been given access to. Flight plans included unusual restrictions about photographic equipment and post-mission communications, while mission timing seemed coordinated with ground operations that weren't described in our briefing materials. Most significantly, we were instructed to maintain specific altitude and course parameters that seemed designed to provide optimal observation of ground operations rather than delivery of ordnance against fixed targets. The ammunition load was minimal, defensive rounds only, suggesting that our primary function was surveillance rather than close air support. Everything about the mission felt like preparation for witnessing something rather than accomplishing something. Captain Hendricks emphasized operational security in ways that exceeded normal requirements for routine missions. We were told that radio communications should be limited to essential navigation and safety information, that all observations should be recorded in personal logs rather than discussed over open frequencies, and that post-mission debriefings would be conducted by personnel who hadn't been identified during the briefing. The implications of such restrictions were clear. Whatever we were going to observe wasn't meant to be discussed through normal military channels. The intelligence summary included references to recent enemy activity that seemed inconsistent with previous reports from the same area. Ground units had reported unusual tactical situations involving coordination between enemy forces that exceeded documented capabilities, while psychological evaluations of American personnel who had operated in the region revealed trauma patterns that didn't match conventional combat stress indicators. Other aircrew who had flown similar missions were notably absent from the briefing, and attempts to gather informal intelligence from ground personnel revealed reluctance to discuss operational details that suggested classification levels beyond our security clearances. The base operations officer, normally forthcoming about mission requirements and tactical considerations, seemed uncomfortable when asked about support assets or contingency planning for potential emergency situations. Weather conditions for the mission were marginal, low cloud cover that would restrict visibility while providing concealment for aircraft operations, but also creating navigation challenges that would require precise instrument flying throughout most of the mission profile. The monsoon season had begun, bringing daily thunderstorms that could ground aircraft for hours while creating humidity levels that affected both human performance and mechanical systems in ways that couldn't be completely predicted or controlled. The flight to the target area took us over landscape that seemed designed to conceal whatever was happening beneath the triple canopy jungle that stretched unbroken from horizon to horizon. Occasional bombing craters from previous missions punctuated the green expanse like wounds that nature was slowly healing, while rivers snaked through vegetation like brown arteries, carrying unknown cargo toward destinations that remained hidden from aerial observation. The few clearings visible from our altitude were mostly the result of previous military operations. Landing zones carved from jungle by engineer units, fire bases that had been abandoned and reclaimed by vegetation, supply drops that had created temporary openings in the canopy. As we approached the coordinates, visual conditions began deteriorating in ways that made observation difficult but not impossible. Clouds formed layers that required constant altitude adjustments to maintain visual contact with the ground, while humidity created haze that reduced effective range for optical equipment. The jungle below appeared empty of human activity, but intelligence reports had warned that enemy forces in the region possessed concealment capabilities that rendered normal visual reconnaissance unreliable. Ground control vectored us into a holding pattern at 25,000 feet, high enough to avoid anti-aircraft threats that intelligence reports suggested were minimal in the area, but low enough to observe tactical developments through breaks in vegetation that allowed limited visibility of ground operations. The radio traffic from ground units suggested routine reconnaissance activities proceeding according to established procedures, with American personnel reporting progress that met expectations based on previous operations in similar terrain. The American reconnaissance platoon was conducting what appeared to be a standard sweep through terrain that intelligence reports had identified as a possible supply route connecting Cambodian border areas with enemy positions deeper inside South Vietnam. Their movement followed tactical procedures that had proven effective in previous operations, with advance elements maintaining appropriate intervals, while support personnel positioned themselves to provide covering fire if contact developed with hostile forces. But as I watched through binoculars, details began emerging that challenged basic assumptions about what constitutes normal military operations. The platoon's advance was taking them through terrain that offered unlimited concealment to potential adversaries while providing minimal opportunities for mutual support between American elements. Their formation suggested confidence in intelligence reports that might not have reflected actual tactical conditions on the ground. Individual soldiers moved with the careful precision of men who understood they were operating in hostile territory, but their body language suggested psychological pressure that exceeded normal combat stress. Even from altitude, I could see hesitation in their movements, frequent stops to examine terrain features that shouldn't have required such attention, communications between elements that seemed more frequent than tactical situations warranted. The first indication that something was developing beyond routine reconnaissance came through radio intercepts from frequencies that weren't included in our official communications plan. Vietnamese voices speaking in tones that suggested coordination of activities that remained invisible to American forces on the ground. The transmissions were brief and followed patterns that indicated detailed knowledge of American positions and movement plans. But what made these intercepts particularly disturbing was evidence that enemy forces were maneuvering to surround the American platoon using terrain features and timing that suggested intelligence about the mission that could only have come from sources with access to classified planning information. The Vietnamese weren't responding to American activities. They were anticipating them with precision that implied systematic surveillance capabilities. Then the situation began deteriorating with mechanical inevitability that suggested careful orchestration rather than tactical opportunism. The American platoon entered a clearing where their formation became visible from multiple directions simultaneously, while dense vegetation provided perfect concealment for adversaries who had apparently been waiting for exactly such an opportunity. The engagement developed according to no recognizable military logic. Instead of direct fire that would reveal enemy positions, the Vietnamese forces used psychological pressure designed to create confusion and panic among American personnel who suddenly found themselves unable to identify threats or coordinate effective responses. Individual soldiers reported being tracked by enemies they couldn't locate, followed through dense vegetation by adversaries who seemed to possess supernatural stealth capabilities. Radio communications fragmented as squad leaders lost contact with subordinate elements despite remaining within visual range, while platoon commanders described tactical situations that seemed to violate basic assumptions about how guerrilla forces should behave. Equipment failures occurred simultaneously across multiple positions, suggesting sabotage conducted by enemies who had achieved access to American defensive positions without being detected. From our altitude, the tactical situation appeared manageable. An isolated American unit facing harassment from enemy forces who lacked the strength to mount sustained attacks against well-trained personnel equipped with superior weapons and communications equipment. But radio intercepts revealed psychological breakdown that was affecting individual soldiers despite the absence of conventional military pressure. The Americans below began exhibiting behavior that violated every principle of military discipline they had been trained to follow. Individual soldiers abandoned positions without orders. Equipment was scattered through vegetation in patterns that suggested panic rather than tactical withdrawal, and unit cohesion dissolved as men who had functioned effectively as a team suddenly became isolated individuals struggling with fears they couldn't identify or articulate. But what made the situation particularly horrifying to observe from our position was the systematic nature of the psychological assault being conducted against American personnel. The Vietnamese forces weren't trying to inflict casualties through direct engagement. They were destroying military effectiveness through techniques that targeted individual weaknesses with surgical precision. Each American soldier seemed to be experiencing personalized psychological pressure designed to exploit specific vulnerabilities that normal military training didn't address. Some reported hearing voices that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. Others described equipment that functioned normally until critical moments when failures occurred, with timing that seemed deliberately calculated to create maximum stress. The breakdown spread through American positions like a psychological contagion that affected personnel regardless of their previous combat experience or training. Veterans who had demonstrated courage during conventional engagements were exhibiting symptoms that suggested complete loss of military bearing, while newer personnel were becoming catatonic in ways that rendered them incapable of following orders or maintaining basic self-defense procedures. Radio traffic reached levels of incoherence that made coordination impossible, as individual soldiers reported tactical situations that contradicted direct observations from other personnel occupying the same positions. Unit commanders struggled to maintain control over subordinate elements that were experiencing different versions of the same events, creating confusion that paralyzed decision-making at every level of command. From my position in the B-29, suspended between earth and sky, in a machine designed to deliver strategic destruction with industrial precision, I found myself witnessing the systematic dismantling of American military effectiveness through techniques that seemed to transcend normal categories of psychological warfare. What was happening below represented evolution in conflict that challenged fundamental assumptions about how modern wars should be fought. The Vietnamese forces responsible for this demonstration possessed capabilities that exceeded anything documented in intelligence reports about enemy tactical doctrine. They had developed methods for neutralizing American advantages in equipment, training, and fire support by attacking psychological foundations that made organized military resistance possible. But most disturbing was the recognition that conventional military responses were not only ineffective against such tactics, but might actually increase their psychological impact by demonstrating the irrelevance of technological superiority when confronted with adversaries who understood human psychology deeply enough to exploit weaknesses that existed below the threshold of conscious awareness. The radio silence that followed was more profound than any noise, carrying implications that extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations. Frequencies that had been filled with panicked communications suddenly carried only static that seemed to echo across infinite distances, leaving those of us in the aircraft to contemplate what we had witnessed without adequate vocabulary for describing experiences that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of modern warfare. The flight back to base passed in contemplative silence that affected our entire crew in ways that became apparent only during post-mission procedures. Routine tasks that normally required minimal attention, navigation calculations, systems monitoring, communications protocols, seemed to demand conscious effort that suggested psychological pressure none of us were equipped to process completely. We had witnessed something that exceeded the parameters of our training and experience, leaving us with knowledge that felt heavier than any ordnance load we had ever carried. The debriefing was conducted by personnel who seemed more interested in ensuring that we understood the classified nature of what we had observed than in gathering intelligence that might prevent similar incidents in the future. They used careful language about operational security and compartmentalized information while avoiding direct discussion of psychological warfare techniques or enemy capabilities that exceeded official parameters for Vietnamese forces operating in that region. Colonel Thompson, who conducted the primary debriefing, was someone I had never seen before, despite months of service at the same base. He spoke with the precise diction of a man who had spent considerable time crafting questions that would elicit specific information while avoiding topics that exceeded our security clearances. His questions focused on technical details, Altitudes maintained, radio frequencies monitored, navigation procedures followed, rather than observations that might have strategic or tactical significance. Most disturbing was their apparent lack of surprise at our account of events. These men had known what we were going to observe before we ever took off, had positioned us to witness something that couldn't be acknowledged through normal military channels. We weren't combat aircrew who had accidentally encountered classified operations. We were carefully selected observers documenting capabilities that existed beyond the reach of conventional military analysis. The paperwork involved in post-mission procedures exceeded anything required for routine operations, including security agreements that restricted discussion of mission details with personnel who hadn't been specifically cleared for access to information we had gathered. Our personal logs were confiscated and replaced with official reports that summarized our observations in language so sanitized that anyone reading them would conclude we had witnessed routine reconnaissance operations involving minimal enemy contact. Flight Officer Martinez, our bombardier, attempted to discuss technical aspects of what we had observed with intelligence personnel who had been absent from the initial debriefing. His questions about psychological warfare capabilities and enemy tactical coordination were redirected toward conventional military topics that bore no relationship to the events we had actually witnessed. The message was clear. Certain observations weren't meant to be analyzed through normal intelligence channels, regardless of their potential significance for future operations. Sergeant O'Malley, our radio operator, reported anomalies in enemy communications that suggested coordination capabilities far exceeding documented Vietnamese technical resources. His analysis of frequency patterns and transmission timing indicated sophisticated equipment and training that contradicted intelligence estimates about enemy organizational capacity. But his technical expertise was dismissed through references to classification levels that precluded detailed discussion of signals intelligence procedures. In the days that followed, I found myself avoiding conversations about the mission, even with crew members who had shared the experience. The subject felt too dangerous to discuss casually, carrying implications about American military vulnerability that none of us were equipped to process without institutional support that clearly wasn't going to be provided. Attempts to discuss tactical lessons learned or psychological observations were met with reminders about security restrictions that effectively prohibited any meaningful analysis of what we had witnessed. Other aircrew who had flown similar missions were notably absent from our normal duty assignments, suggesting rotation policies that minimized contact between personnel who had been exposed to classified operations. The base operations officer, normally forthcoming about mission planning and tactical coordination, became reluctant to discuss flight schedules or crew assignments that might involve similar reconnaissance requirements. The psychological impact of witnessing military defeat, accomplished through techniques that exceeded official doctrine, became apparent through changes in daily routine that affected everyone who had participated in the mission. Sleep patterns were disrupted by dreams that involved endless circling above jungle clearings, while voices called for help that couldn't be provided. Routine tasks required conscious effort that suggested difficulty concentrating on present responsibilities, while processing memories that challenged fundamental assumptions about American military capabilities. But perhaps most troubling was the recognition that conventional military responses were not only ineffective against psychological warfare tactics, but might actually increase their impact by demonstrating the irrelevance of technological superiority when confronted with adversaries who understood human psychology deeply enough to exploit weaknesses that existed below the threshold of conscious awareness. The institutional response to our mission report suggested that what we had observed represented problems that exceeded the scope of conventional military solutions. Personnel assignments were modified to minimize contact between aircrew who had witnessed similar operations, while training programs were adjusted to emphasize psychological resilience rather than technical competence. The implications were clear. American forces were confronting challenges that traditional military doctrine hadn't anticipated and couldn't effectively address. Medical evaluations conducted weeks after the mission revealed stress indicators that resembled combat fatigue, but without the physiological markers typically associated with exposure to conventional military threats. The psychological profile suggested trauma that was precisely targeted to exploit individual vulnerabilities, creating symptoms that were difficult to treat through standard military medical procedures. Requests for transfer to different duty assignments were processed with unusual efficiency, suggesting institutional recognition that personnel who had been exposed to certain operational realities might not be suitable for continued service in similar capacities. The rotation policies seemed designed to minimize the concentration of knowledge about capabilities that exceeded official acknowledgement, while ensuring that institutional memory of such events was distributed across personnel who were unlikely to maintain contact after military service ended. If you want more stories they never wanted recorded, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. The nightmares started months after my return to civilian life. Quiet dreams where I circled endlessly above jungle clearings while voices called for help that I couldn't provide. In these dreams, I could see individual faces among the scattered American soldiers, young men looking up at my aircraft with expressions that mixed confusion and terror, and something that might have been accusation for failing to intervene when intervention might have made a difference. But intervention hadn't been possible. And that knowledge became the hardest part of carrying memories that couldn't be shared with family members who deserved explanations I wasn't authorized to provide. The mission had ended that night, but the psychological weight of witnessing military defeat, accomplished through techniques that challenged everything I believed about American capabilities, continued for decades. Sometimes, when civilian aircraft pass overhead at altitudes that remind me of strategic bombing operations, I find myself wondering what other events occurred in remote locations where witnesses were limited to aircrew who understood that certain observations weren't meant to be discussed. How many military failures were attributed to equipment problems or tactical errors when the real causes involved capabilities that exceeded the parameters of official doctrine? The truth, I've learned, isn't always something that can be preserved through official channels or institutional memory. Sometimes it survives only in the minds of individuals who were present when events occurred that challenged fundamental assumptions about how the world should operate. Being a witness carries responsibilities that extend beyond military service or patriotic duty. It requires preserving knowledge that might be the only evidence that certain events ever happened. The mission ended that night, but the truth never did.